A Court of Thieves. Francesca Barone had spent her life knowing the rules. But when Lorenzo De Luca kissed her in the dark, when his hands bruised and his mouth claimed, she forgot every single one. Now, as her father declared war, she felt his presence behind her, his voice a whisper against her ear. "You should have walked away," he murmured. "Because now I won't stop until you belong to me." Chapter 1. The Shadow of a Forgotten Promise. The scent of old money and older secrets clung to the walls of the Barone Palazzo, a suffocating perfume Francesca had grown used to over 58 years. Sunlight, fractured by the antique stained glass windows, painted the marble floor in hues of ruby and sapphire, a fleeting beauty in a house steeped in shadows. Francesca traced the intricate patterns with a finger, her touch lingering on a depiction of a snarling wolf, the Barone family crest. A symbol of power, of ruthlessness, a symbol she'd come to resent. She'd spent her life adhering to the rigid structure of the famiglia. Daughter of Don Antonio Barone, she'd learned early the price of disobedience, the weight of expectation. Her marriage to Emilio, a cold and calculating man chosen for her, had been a strategic alliance, a strengthening of the Barone Empire. 20 years of a loveless union, producing no children, only a gnawing emptiness that had settled deep in her bones. Emilio's death 5 years prior, a sudden heart attack during a heated negotiation with a rival family, had brought a strange mix of relief and a deeper, more profound loneliness. She was free, in a sense, but the freedom felt hollow. The gilded cage had been her entire world. Now, the bars were gone, but she had nowhere to fly. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of a nearby antique mirror, a woman with silver threading through her dark hair, lines etched around her expressive eyes, a mouth that rarely smiled. A woman who had perfected the art of appearing strong, of concealing the vulnerability that churned beneath the surface. She looked every bit the grieving widow, the respected matriarch, but inside, a storm raged. A storm of regret, of what-ifs, of a yearning for something more. A soft chime echoed through the vast hall, announcing the arrival of her father's consigliere, Marco Rossi. Marco, with his perpetually worried eyes and a loyalty that ran deeper than blood, had been a constant presence in her life, a confidant in a world where trust was a dangerous commodity. "Francesca," he greeted, his voice low and respectful. He held a small, velvet-lined box in his hands. "Your father asked me to deliver this." She took the box, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of the clasp. Inside, nestled on a bed of crimson silk, lay a single, antique key. It was ornate, crafted from heavy silver, with the Barone wolf intricately carved into the handle. She recognized it instantly. "The villa," she breathed, her voice catching in her throat. It was the key to Villa Speranza, a secluded estate overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. A place of childhood memories, of laughter and fleeting moments of happiness before the weight of her family's legacy had settled upon her shoulders. A place her father had forbidden her to visit after her marriage, a place he claimed held too many painful memories of her mother. He said you should go," Marco continued, his gaze averted. "He believes it's time." Time for what? Francesca wondered, a knot forming in her stomach. Time for more secrets to be unearthed? Time for another layer of her carefully constructed world to crumble? She closed the box, the key heavy in her palm. The villa had always represented a forbidden escape, a whisper of a life she could have had. A life where choices were her own, where love wasn't a transaction, where the weight of the Barone name didn't suffocate her. Later that evening, after a dinner eaten in strained silence with her father, a man who communicated more through glares and clipped commands than actual conversation, Francesca found herself standing on the balcony of her bedroom, the city lights twinkling below like scattered diamonds. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant rumble of the city, a constant reminder of the world she was both a part of and apart from. Her father's uncharacteristic gesture with the villa key was unsettling. Antonio Barone did nothing without a reason, without calculating the potential gain or loss. This sudden act of kindness, if it could even be called that, felt like a prelude to something else. Something bigger, something more dangerous. She clutched the key tighter, the cold metal digging into her skin. A forgotten promise, made to herself long ago, resurfaced. A promise to find her own way, to break free from the suffocating expectations of her family. A promise that had been buried beneath years of duty and resignation. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the balcony, carrying with it the faint sound of music, a melancholic melody played on a distant violin. It was a tune she recognized, a song her mother used to hum when Francesca was a child. A song about longing, about freedom, about a love that defied all boundaries. The music, the key, her father's cryptic message, it all felt connected, a tangled web of past and present, pulling her towards an uncertain future. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that her carefully ordered life was about to be shattered. And a part of her, the part that had been dormant for so long, was strangely ready. The breeze had stilled the tears forming at the corners of Francesca's eyes, leaving a sense of cold dread in their place. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Palazzo Gardens. The following morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky mirroring the unease that had settled over Francesca. She dressed in a simple black dress, a habit from years of mourning, and descended to the Palazzo Gardens. The gardens were her sanctuary, a meticulously manicured oasis of calm amidst the turmoil of her life. Roses, heavy with dew, bloomed in a riot of colors, their fragrance a sharp contrast to the lingering scent of rain from the night before. She walked along the gravel paths, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The air was thick with humidity, a promise of another storm brewing. The gardeners, all trusted employees who had served the Barone family for generations, bowed their heads in silent respect as she passed. They knew better than to intrude on her solitude. Reaching a secluded corner of the garden, dominated by a centuries-old olive tree, Francesca sat on a stone bench, the cool surface seeping through the thin fabric of her dress. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet the turmoil within her. But the image of the key, the memory of her father's unsettling words, refused to fade. A sudden rustle in the nearby bushes startled her. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding against her ribs. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, imposing, and undeniably unsettling. Lorenzo De Luca, the son of her father's greatest rival, Don Alessandro De Luca. A man she had been taught to fear, to despise. A man who, by all rights, should be her enemy. He stood there, a few feet away, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He was even more striking than she remembered from the few, fleeting encounters they'd had over the years, always at a distance, always under the watchful eyes of their families. His hair was dark, almost black, and swept back from a face that was both ruggedly handsome and undeniably dangerous. He wore a dark suit that accentuated his broad shoulders and lean physique, the fabric clinging to him like a second skin. "Signora Barone," he greeted, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. His Italian was flawless, but with a subtle undercurrent of something else. Something that hinted at a life lived on the edge, a life where danger was a constant companion. "Signor De Luca," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show any sign of the fear that was churning inside her. "What are you doing here?" He took a step closer, his presence filling the small space. The scent of his cologne, a heady mix of sandalwood and something darker, more primal, reached her, making her senses swim. "I came to offer my condolences," he said, his voice deceptively soft. "On the anniversary of your husband's passing." Francesca stiffened. The anniversary had been weeks ago. His words were a thinly veiled excuse, a deliberate provocation. "My father will not be pleased to see you here," she said, her voice tight. A ghost of a smile played on his lips. "I'm not here to see your father." His gaze lingered on her, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin prickle with awareness. It was a look that stripped away her carefully constructed facade, a look that saw the woman beneath the widow, the vulnerability beneath the strength. "Then why are you here, Signor De Luca?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He took another step, closing the distance between them. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the subtle tension that crackled in the air. "I came to see you, Francesca," he said, his voice dropping to a husky murmur. He used her given name, a familiarity that was both shocking and strangely thrilling. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "I've been watching you," he continued, his eyes dark and intense. "For a long time." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The whispers, the rumors, the stories she'd heard about Lorenzo De Luca flooded her mind. He was known for his ruthlessness, his charm, his ability to get what he wanted, no matter the cost. He was a predator, a wolf in designer clothing. And she was prey. Yet, beneath the fear, a flicker of something else ignited within her. A spark of defiance, a hint of desire. It was a dangerous game, a dance on the edge of a knife, but she couldn't deny the pull, the magnetic force that drew her to him. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "You're not like them, Francesca," he whispered. "You're different. You have a fire in you, a spirit that refuses to be tamed." His words were a mirror to her own hidden desires, a validation of the longing she'd suppressed for so long. But they were also a threat, a promise of upheaval, of a world turned upside down. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell. Marco, his face etched with concern, hurried towards them. "Signora Barone," he said, his voice sharp. "Your father is asking for you." He glanced at Lorenzo, his expression hardening. "Signor De Luca, I must ask you to leave. Your presence here is unwelcome." Lorenzo straightened, a smirk playing on his lips. He gave Francesca one last, lingering look, a look that promised he wasn't finished with her. "Until next time, Francesca," he said, his voice a low purr. Then, he turned and vanished back into the shadows, leaving Francesca trembling in his wake. Marco was watching her with worried eyes. She had paled significantly, and there was no disguising her reaction, nor his suspicion. Chapter 3. A dance with the enemy's son. The summons from her father was, as expected, less a request and more a command. Francesca found him in his study, a room dominated by dark wood paneling, heavy antique furniture, and the ever-present scent of cigar smoke. He was pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression thunderous. "Lorenzo De Luca," he spat, the name a curse on his lips. "In my gardens. Speaking to you." Francesca remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She knew better than to interrupt him when he was in this state. Any attempt at explanation would only fuel his anger. "What did he want?" he demanded, stopping in front of her, his eyes narrowed. "He offered his condolences," she said, keeping her voice neutral. It was a partial truth, a carefully constructed evasion. Her father snorted. "Condolences? 5 years after Emilio's death? Don't insult my intelligence, Francesca." He resumed his pacing, his agitation radiating off him in waves. "The De Lucas are scavengers, vultures circling, waiting for any sign of weakness. They've been trying to undermine us for decades, to steal our territory, our influence." Francesca knew this all too well. The feud between the Baroness and the De Lucas was legendary, a bloody tapestry woven with betrayal, violence, and a thirst for revenge that spanned generations. It was a war fought in the shadows, a constant battle for power and control. "I understand, father," she said quietly. "Do you?" He challenged, his gaze piercing. "Do you understand the danger he represents? The threat he poses to everything we've built?" She understood the danger, yes. But she also understood something else, something she couldn't voice. She understood the allure. The forbidden thrill of being close to the enemy, of feeling the heat of his gaze, the brush of his touch. "He won't be back," she said, hoping her voice didn't betray the lie. Her father stopped pacing and studied her, his eyes searching. He was a shrewd man, a master manipulator. He could sense deception, could smell fear. "See that he doesn't," he said finally, his voice low and menacing. And stay away from the villa. I've changed my mind. It's not safe. The abrupt reversal stung. The brief flicker of hope, the promise of escape, was extinguished. She was back in the cage, the bars firmly in place. As you wish, father, she said, her voice flat. He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his attention already shifting to other matters, to the endless machinations of the famiglia. Francesca left the study, her heart heavy. Her father's warning only reinforced the danger of her encounter with Lorenzo. But it also fueled a rebellious spark within her, a refusal to be controlled, to be dictated to. That evening, she found herself drawn back to the gardens. The air was cooler now, the scent of roses mingling with the earthy aroma of the approaching night. She walked to the spot where she had met Lorenzo, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She wasn't expecting him to be there. And yet, a part of her hoped. He was. He was leaning against the olive tree, his silhouette outlined against the fading light. He turned as she approached, a slow smile spreading across his face. I knew you'd come, he said, his voice a low murmur. My father forbids it, she said, her voice trembling slightly. And do you always obey your father, Francesca? He asked, his eyes challenging. She didn't answer. Instead, she took a step closer, drawn to him by an invisible force. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His fingers were strong, calloused, the hands of a man who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. This is madness, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Perhaps, he agreed, his gaze locking with hers. But sometimes, madness is the only way to feel alive. He pulled her closer, his body a warm, solid presence against hers. She could feel the beat of his heart, the subtle rise and fall of his chest. The scent of his cologne enveloped her, intoxicating her senses. We shouldn't be doing this, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. We should have done this a long time ago, he countered, his voice husky. He tilted her chin up, his eyes searching hers. She saw a flicker of something there, something beyond the danger, beyond the rivalry, something that looked like vulnerability. And then, he kissed her. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, a claiming of territory. His lips were soft, yet demanding, his tongue exploring her mouth with a possessiveness that both frightened and thrilled her. She responded, hesitantly at first, then with a growing urgency, her own desires rising to the surface. It was a kiss that shattered the boundaries, that defied the rules, that ignited a fire within her she thought had long been extinguished. It was a kiss that sealed her fate. When he finally pulled away, she was breathless, her body trembling. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of desire and something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. You belong to me now, Francesca, he whispered, his voice rough. No matter what your father says. No matter what the cost. His possessive claim rang with the echoes of generations of bad blood and a dark foreboding that filled her. Chapter 4. The Weight of Family Secrets. The days following the stolen kiss in the garden were a blur of conflicting emotions. Francesca found herself caught between fear and exhilaration, duty and desire. Lorenzo's words, "You belong to me now," echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the dangerous game she was playing. She avoided her father as much as possible, the weight of her secret growing heavier with each passing day. She knew she was walking a tightrope. One wrong step could send her plummeting into the abyss. The feud between the Baroness and the De Lucas was not a game, it was a war, and she was now caught in the crossfire. She tried to focus on her routine, the familiar tasks that had always provided a sense of order and control. She oversaw the household staff, managed the family finances, and attended the endless social gatherings that were expected of a woman in her position. But her mind was elsewhere, her thoughts consumed by Lorenzo. She replayed the kiss in her mind, over and over. The feel of his lips on hers, the warmth of his body, the intensity of his gaze. It was a dangerous obsession, a forbidden craving that she couldn't seem to control. One afternoon, while sorting through some old papers in her late husband's study, she stumbled upon a hidden compartment in his desk. Inside, she found a small leather-bound journal. Her heart pounded as she recognized Emilio's handwriting. She hesitated, knowing that she was intruding on his privacy, even in death. But curiosity and a growing sense of unease compelled her to open it. The journal entries were sporadic, spanning several years. They revealed a side of Emilio she had never known, a man consumed by ambition, by a ruthless desire for power. He wrote of his dealings with other families, of his plans to expand the Barone Empire, of his frustration with his childless marriage. But it was the later entries that truly shocked her. Emilio wrote of a growing suspicion, a fear that his own father-in-law, Don Antonio, was plotting against him. He suspected that Antonio saw him as a threat, a rival to be eliminated. Francesca's blood ran cold. Could it be true? Could her own father have been responsible for Emilio's death? The thought was horrifying, a betrayal that shattered her understanding of her family, of the world she had always known. She read on, her hands trembling. Emilio wrote of a secret meeting he had planned with someone he trusted, someone who could provide him with evidence of Antonio's treachery. He didn't name the person, but he referred to them as the Serpent. The final entry was dated the day before Emilio's death. He wrote of his fear, his desperation, but also of his determination to expose the truth. Francesca closed the journal, her mind reeling. The Serpent. Who was it? And what role did they play in Emilio's death? And more importantly, what role did they play in the current conflict between the Baroness and the De Lucas? She felt a growing sense of dread, a certainty that she was caught in a web of secrets far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She needed answers, but she didn't know where to turn. She thought of Lorenzo. He was the enemy, yes, but he was also the only person who seemed to see her, to understand the turmoil within her. He was a risk, a danger, but he was also a possibility. She knew she shouldn't trust him, but she found herself drawn to him, to his strength, his confidence, his honesty. He had made no secret of his desire for her, of his intention to claim her as his own. That evening, she found a single red rose lying on her pillow, its petals still damp with dew. There was no note, but she knew who it was from. It was a silent message, a reminder of his presence, of his promise. She held the rose to her face, inhaling its sweet fragrance. It was a symbol of love, of passion, but also of danger, of the thorns that lay hidden beneath the beauty. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't resist the heat. She was drawn to the flame, to the promise of something more, something real, even if it meant risking everything. She was still gazing at the rose, its thorns now seeming more significant, when Marco quietly knocked and entered. He looked very nervous, almost afraid. "Francesca," he began hesitantly. There's been an attack. A De Luca warehouse bombed. Several men are dead." The news was chilling, setting the stage for a new and frightening conflict. Chapter 5. Echoes of Betrayal in the Rain. The news of the bombing sent a shockwave through the Barone household. The fragile peace, always tenuous, had been shattered. War was imminent. Francesca felt a cold dread grip her heart. She knew, instinctively, that Lorenzo would believe her father was responsible. The attack fit Antonio's MO, ruthless, decisive, and designed to send a clear message. Marco's worried gaze met hers. "Your father, he denies any involvement. But the De Lucas, they're demanding retribution." Francesca nodded, her mind racing. She had to see Lorenzo. She had to warn him, to try to prevent further bloodshed. Even if it meant betraying her family, even if it meant risking her own life. She slipped out of the palazzo under the cover of darkness, the city shrouded in a thick fog. The streets were deserted, the only sound the distant wail of a siren. She made her way to a small, discreet trattoria in a neutral neighborhood, a place where members of rival families sometimes met to negotiate, to avoid all-out war. She sent a message, a coded phrase known only to a select few, and waited. The rain started as she sat alone at a table in the back, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of garlic and anticipation. She jumped at every sound, her nerves on edge. He arrived an hour later, his face grim, his eyes dark with fury. He didn't say a word, just sat down across from her, his presence filling the small space. "I had nothing to do with it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He studied her, his gaze intense, searching. He was trying to gauge her sincerity, to see if she was lying. "Your father," he began, his voice tight, with controlled rage. "He denies it," she interrupted. "But I don't know if I believe him." She told him about the journal, about Emilio's suspicions, about the mysterious serpent. She revealed everything, holding nothing back. It was a betrayal of her family, a dangerous gamble, but she had no choice. Lorenzo listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on her. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I don't want any more bloodshed. Because I believe you." The last part was a lie, or at least a partial lie. She didn't fully trust him, not yet. But she trusted him more than she trusted her own father. And she was drawn to him, to his strength, to the way he made her feel alive. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. His fingers were warm and strong, a comforting presence in the midst of the chaos. "I believe you too, Francesca," he said, his voice husky. "But my family, they won't. They're demanding revenge." She knew this was true. The code of the mafia was unforgiving. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. "There has to be another way," she pleaded. "We can't let this escalate into a full-scale war." He squeezed her hand, his gaze softening. "I'll try," he promised, "but I can't guarantee anything." He stood up, pulling her with him. He led her out of the trattoria, into the rain-slicked streets. The city was a blur of lights and shadows, a dangerous labyrinth where enemies lurked around every corner. He pulled her into a narrow alleyway, shielding her from the downpour. He leaned close, his body a warm, solid presence against hers. "I have to go," he said, his voice rough, "but I'll be in touch." He kissed her then, a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke of fear, of desire, of a connection that defied all logic. It was a kiss that sealed their alliance, a promise of a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating. When he pulled away, she was breathless, her body trembling. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of emotions. "Stay safe, Francesca," he whispered, "and trust no one." Then, he vanished into the night, leaving her alone in the rain, the echoes of his kiss still lingering on her lips. The rain plastered her dress to her body, and she suddenly realized that her shoes were soaked and her feet numb, but that she also held a new, dangerous hope. But the chilling echo of his last warning was the strongest sensation. Chapter 6. A Forbidden Touch in the Dark. The following days were a tense waiting game. Francesca moved through her life like a ghost, her senses heightened, her mind constantly replaying Lorenzo's warning, "Trust no one." She found herself scrutinizing everyone around her, the household staff, her father's advisors, even Marco, her longtime confidant. Could any of them be the serpent? The thought was unsettling, a constant reminder of the betrayal that lurked beneath the surface of her family's seemingly unified front. Her father was unusually quiet, withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his study, the only sign of his presence the occasional muffled shout or the acrid smell of cigar smoke. She knew he was planning something, but she couldn't get close enough to find out what. She received no word from Lorenzo, which only heightened her anxiety. She feared for his safety, for the fate of his family, and for the future of their fragile alliance. One night, unable to sleep, she found herself drawn to the villa key, still tucked away in the velvet-lined box. Her father had forbidden her to go, but his words only fueled her defiance. She needed to escape, to clear her head, to find some semblance of peace. She dressed in dark clothing, slipped out of the palazzo unnoticed, and drove her own small, inconspicuous car to Villa Speranza. The drive was long and winding, the road snaking along the coastline. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, casting the landscape in an eerie darkness. The villa was exactly as she remembered it, a sprawling, two-story building perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was beautiful, yet melancholic, a relic of a bygone era. The air was thick with the scent of salt and sea air, a sharp contrast to the stuffy atmosphere of the palazzo. She used the key to unlock the heavy wooden door, stepping inside. The villa was dark and silent, the only sound the distant roar of the waves crashing against the rocks below. Dust motes danced in the moonlight that filtered through the windows, illuminating the faded grandeur of the interior. She wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the villa a ghostly appearance. She found her mother's old room, untouched since her death. The scent of her perfume, a delicate floral fragrance, still lingered in the air, a poignant reminder of the woman she had lost too soon. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes filling with tears. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, of loss, of a life that had been stolen from her. A sudden noise startled her. She jumped up, her heart pounding. She heard footsteps coming from the hallway. She grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table, her hand trembling. She held it up, ready to defend herself. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped into the room. Lorenzo. He was silhouetted against the dim light, his face hidden in shadow. "Francesca," he said, his voice a low murmur. Relief washed over her, followed by a surge of anger. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You scared me half to death." He took a step closer, his features becoming clearer in the moonlight. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, but his gaze was as intense as ever. "I followed you," he said. "I was worried." "Worried?" she scoffed. "You're the one who told me to trust no one." "And I meant it," he said, his voice softening. "But you're different." He reached out and took the candlestick from her hand, setting it down on the table. He then took her hand, his touch sending a familiar jolt of electricity through her. "I had to see you," he said, his voice husky. "I had to make sure you were safe." She looked at him, her anger fading, replaced by a growing warmth. She saw the concern in his eyes, the genuine care that he couldn't hide. He pulled her closer, his body a warm, solid presence against hers. She leaned into him, her head resting on his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart, the gentle rise and fall of his breath. "I found something," he said, his voice low. "Something that might help us." He told her about his investigation, about the clues he had uncovered, about the growing suspicion that the serpent was someone within her own family, someone close to her father. "I don't know who it is yet," he said. "But I'm getting closer." He tilted her chin up, his eyes searching hers. "I need your help, Francesca," he said. "I need you to be my eyes and ears inside the palazzo." It was a dangerous request, a betrayal of her family, but she didn't hesitate. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. He kissed her then, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of trust, of a bond that was growing stronger with each passing moment. It was a kiss that banished the darkness, that filled her with a sense of hope, of a future that might actually be possible. When the kiss ended, the world shifted. He had been looking at her with tenderness, but now, a barely controlled fire flared. His hands moved possessively over her body. He found the buttons on her blouse and began to unfasten them. There was hunger, not just desire, in his eyes. It seemed that the forbidden nature of their relationship was a driving force, a need. It was also overwhelming. "Lorenzo," she breathed, part protest, part plea, part invitation. Chapter 7. The Price of Loyalty and Desire. Lorenzo's hands moved with a deliberate slowness, each touch a spark against her skin. The cool air of the villa contrasted sharply with the heat that flared between them. He unbuttoned her blouse, his knuckles brushing against her, sending shivers down her spine. She closed her eyes, her senses overwhelmed by his proximity, by the intoxicating scent of his cologne, by the raw desire that emanated from him. "Francesca," he murmured, his voice rough with need. He pushed the fabric aside, revealing the delicate lace of her bra. His gaze lingered there, a possessive gleam in his eyes. She reached for him, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the curve of his neck. She felt the tension in his body, the coiled energy that was barely held in check. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against the hollow of her throat. She arched her back, offering herself to him, her body responding instinctively to his touch. It was a surrender, a giving in to the forbidden desire that had been simmering between them since that first stolen kiss. He unclasped her bra, his fingers fumbling slightly, a testament to the urgency of his need. Her breasts spilled free, the cool air raising goosebumps on her skin. He cupped them in his hands, his thumbs tracing circles around her nipples, drawing them into tight peaks. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She had never felt this way before, this raw, primal need, this complete abandonment of control. It was terrifying and exhilarating, a dangerous dance on the edge of a precipice. He lowered his mouth to her breast, his tongue flicking out, teasing her nipple. She moaned, her fingers digging into his shoulders, her body arching towards him. He suckled her, drawing her deeper into his mouth, his teeth grazing her skin, sending waves of pleasure through her. She felt a desperate need to touch him, to feel his skin against hers. She unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers clumsy with haste. She pushed the fabric aside, revealing the hard planes of his chest, the dark hair that trailed down his abdomen. He shrugged out of his shirt, his muscles flexing in the moonlight. He was a magnificent specimen of a man, sculpted and powerful, a predator in his prime. And she was his prey, willingly caught in his trap. He pulled her down onto the bed, their bodies entwining. He kissed her deeply, his tongue plundering her mouth, his hands roaming over her body, exploring every curve, every inch of her skin. She responded with equal fervor, her own hands exploring his body, tracing the lines of his muscles, feeling the strength that lay beneath the surface. She was lost in the moment, consumed by desire, by a need that transcended all reason, all loyalty, all fear. They made love with a fierce intensity, a desperate hunger that had been building for weeks. It was a joining of bodies, of souls, a fusion of two worlds that were meant to be kept apart. It was a betrayal of everything she had ever known, but it was also a liberation. Afterward, they lay entangled, their bodies slick with sweat, their hearts beating in unison. The silence was broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the distant roar of the waves. Francesca felt a profound sense of peace, of contentment, that she hadn't experienced in years. She was in the arms of the enemy, a man she shouldn't trust, a man who could destroy her. But she had never felt safer, more cherished, more alive. Lorenzo traced a finger along her cheek, his eyes filled with a tenderness she hadn't seen before. "I never thought," he began, his voice husky. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. He had never thought he could feel this way about a Barone, about the daughter of his sworn enemy. "Nor I," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He kissed her again, a soft, lingering kiss that spoke of promises, of a future that was uncertain, but filled with a glimmer of hope. But even in the afterglow of their passion, a shadow of doubt lingered. She knew that their love was a dangerous game, a fragile flower blooming in the midst of a battlefield. The price of their loyalty, their desire, could be their lives. The first rays of sunrise were painting the sky, and Lorenzo gently touched her hair, a question obvious, although unasked. Chapter 8. Masks and Midnight Confessions. The return to the palazzo was a descent back into the world of shadows and secrets. Francesca felt the weight of her deception pressing down on her, the knowledge that she was now living a double life, torn between her loyalty to her family and her love for Lorenzo. She found her father in his usual state of agitation, pacing his study like a caged animal. He barely acknowledged her presence, his mind consumed by the escalating conflict with the DeLucas. "They're retaliating," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Small attacks, probing our defenses. They're testing us." Francesca remained silent, her heart heavy. She knew that Lorenzo was trying to hold his family back, to prevent all-out war, but the pressure on him must be immense. She spent the next few days gathering information, observing the comings and goings of the palazzo, listening to snippets of conversations, trying to identify the serpent. It was a dangerous game, a constant tightrope walk between suspicion and discovery. She noticed a pattern, a subtle shift in the dynamics of the household. Marco, her father's trusted consigliere, seemed to be avoiding her. He was always busy, always preoccupied, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by a guardedness that made her uneasy. Could Marco be the serpent? The thought was painful, a betrayal of a friendship that had spanned decades. But she couldn't ignore the signs, the subtle clues that pointed in his direction. One evening, she found an opportunity to speak to him alone. She cornered him in the library, a room filled with ancient books and the scent of old paper. "Marco," she said, her voice low, "we need to talk." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and sadness. "Francesca," he began, his voice hesitant. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice firm. "I know something's wrong. You've been avoiding me." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. He looked defeated, his usual composure shattered.
"It's complicated," he said. "Tell me," she insisted.
"Please, Marco. I need to know the truth." He hesitated for a moment, then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. He confessed that he had been secretly communicating with the DeLucas for years, feeding them information, acting as their informant. "I did it for you, Francesca," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "I saw how unhappy you were, how trapped you were in your marriage. I wanted to help you, to give you a chance at a better life." He explained that he had been the one who had arranged for Emilio's death, making it look like a heart attack. He had believed he was acting in her best interests, freeing her from a loveless marriage. Francesca was stunned, her mind reeling. Marco, her friend, her confidant, had betrayed her, had murdered her husband. But his motives, twisted as they were rooted in a misguided sense of loyalty, of love. "I never wanted this," she said, her voice trembling. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." "I know," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. And now it's all spiraling out of control." He told her that he had been the one who had planted the idea of the bombing in the DeLuca's minds, hoping to create a rift between Lorenzo and his father, to weaken their family. He had underestimated Lorenzo's strength, his determination to find the truth. "He's coming for me, Francesca," he said, his voice filled with fear.
"He knows it was me."
Francesca felt a surge of pity for Marco, for the man who had been her friend, her protector. He had made a terrible mistake, a series of terrible mistakes, and now he was paying the price. She received an urgent, coded message. It was succinct. "Meet me.
Villa.
Tonight." She went, knowing the mask she had created was about to shatter. She walked in, unsurprised to find Lorenzo waiting. This time, though, his eyes were glacial. "Marco," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He confessed everything. It was a statement, not a question, and it froze her in place. Chapter 9. Scars beneath the surface. The coldness in Lorenzo's eyes sent a shiver down Francesca's spine. It was a stark contrast to the warmth, the passion she had experienced in his arms. This was the dawn of the DeLuca family, the man who commanded respect and fear, the man who held her fate in his hands. "He confessed?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Lorenzo nodded, his gaze unwavering. "He told us everything. His involvement in Emilio's death, his manipulation, his betrayal." Francesca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had suspected Marco, but hearing it confirmed, hearing it from Lorenzo's lips, was a different kind of pain. It was a betrayal of trust, a shattering of the world she had known. What will you do?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately. He walked towards her, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the villa. He stopped in front of her, his presence filling her senses. "He's my father's consigliere," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "The penalty for betrayal is severe." Francesca knew what that meant.
Death.
A swift, brutal end, a message to anyone who dared to cross the DeLucas. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the image, the horror of what was to come. She felt a profound sense of sadness, of loss, not just for Marco, but for the innocence she had lost, for the illusion of safety she had clung to for so long. I understand, she said, her voice barely audible. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers surprisingly gentle. His touch was a stark contrast to the coldness in his eyes, a reminder of the connection they shared, the forbidden love that had blossomed in the midst of the chaos. This changes nothing between us, Francesca, he said, his voice husky. You understand that, don't you? She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the fear was still there, a nagging doubt that wouldn't go away. How can it not? She asked, her voice trembling. Your family, they'll never accept me. I'm a Baronne, the daughter of your enemy. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. I don't care about that, he said, his voice fierce. I care about you. Only you. He kissed her then, a desperate, passionate kiss that was meant to reassure her, to erase her doubts. But the kiss couldn't mask the truth, the reality of their situation. They were caught in a web of lies, of betrayal, of a feud that had spanned generations. When he pulled away, she saw the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his love for her and his duty to his family. I have to go, he said, his voice rough. I have to deal with this. She nodded, understanding. She knew that he had a role to play, a responsibility to uphold. He was a Don, a leader, and he had to put his family first. He left her standing there, alone in the villa, the silence broken only by the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, of isolation, of a future that was uncertain and filled with danger. Later that night, as she lay in bed, unable to sleep, she thought about Lorenzo, about the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. She knew that he had a darkness within him, a ruthlessness that was necessary for survival in his world. But she had also seen his vulnerability, his tenderness, his capacity for love. She also considered Marco, and wondered if perhaps there was a shred of truth in what he had claimed about trying to help her. She knew that their love was a dangerous game, a gamble that could cost them everything. But she was willing to risk it, to fight for a chance at happiness, at a life free from the shadows of the past. She wondered if she was a fool. She finally slept, only to be awoken very early by pounding on her door. It was one of her father's men, grim-faced. Your father demands your presence.
Now.
His tone sent chills down her spine. It was very likely that Antonio had found out everything. Chapter 10. The gathering storm of war. The summons from her father was as ominous as she had feared. She found him in his study, surrounded by his most trusted capos. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with the scent of cigar smoke and impending violence. Antonio Barone was a formidable figure, even in his advanced age. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes like chips of ice. He didn't speak, just stared at her, his gaze piercing. Francesca stood before him, her heart pounding against her ribs. She knew that her secret was out, that her alliance with Lorenzo had been discovered. She had betrayed her family, and now she would face the consequences. One of the capos, a hulking man named Sal DeMarco, stepped forward. He held a small, silver device in his hand, a recording device. We intercepted a communication, he said, his voice gravelly, between you and Lorenzo DeLuca. He played the recording. Francesca's own voice, clear and unmistakable, filled the room. It was a recording of her conversation with Lorenzo at the villa, the night she had confessed Marco's betrayal. She listened in horror as her words, her secrets, were laid bare before her father and his men. She heard her own voice revealing the details of Marco's treachery, her own complicity in the deception. When the recording ended, a chilling silence fell over the room. All eyes were on Francesca, waiting for her reaction, for her defense. But she had no defense. She had betrayed her family, and there was no escaping the consequences. Her father finally spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You dare to conspire with the enemy? To betray your own blood?" I was trying to prevent a war," she said, her voice trembling. Her father scoffed. "War is inevitable, Francesca. It has always been inevitable. And you have chosen the wrong side." He turned to his capos. "Take her," he commanded. "Lock her in her room. She is to have no contact with anyone." Francesca didn't resist as two of the men grabbed her arms and dragged her from the study. She was numb, her mind reeling. She had been prepared for anger, for punishment, but not for this cold, calculated dismissal. She was imprisoned in her own room, the door locked and guarded. She was a prisoner in her own home, a traitor to her family. She spent the next few days in a state of despair, her thoughts consumed by Lorenzo, by the fate that awaited them both. She knew that her father would not show her any mercy. She was a liability, a threat to his power, and he would eliminate her without hesitation. She thought of escaping, of trying to reach Lorenzo, but she knew it was impossible. The palazzo was heavily guarded, every exit watched. She was trapped. One evening, as she sat staring out the window, watching the city lights twinkle below, she heard a faint noise. She turned, her heart pounding. A small, folded piece of paper had been slipped under the door. She grabbed it, her hands trembling. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the message. It was a single sentence, written in Lorenzo's distinctive handwriting. "Be ready. Tonight." Hope surged through her, a flicker of light in the darkness. He was coming for her. He hadn't abandoned her. She spent the rest of the evening preparing, her mind racing. She knew that their escape would be dangerous, that they would be facing impossible odds. But she was ready. She was willing to fight for her freedom, for her love, for a future that might actually be possible. As she sat in wait, there was another sound, a low, guttural scream of rage followed by a series of gunshots. The noise was terrifying, and she knew, somehow, that Lorenzo had arrived. Chapter 11. Broken Vows and Shattered Dreams. The gunshots ripped through the silence of the palazzo, shattering the fragile peace that Francesca had clung to. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that Lorenzo had arrived, that the war had come to her doorstep. She ran to the door, pressing her ear against the wood, trying to make sense of the chaos that was unfolding outside. She heard shouts, screams, the thud of bodies, the shattering of glass. It was a symphony of violence, a testament to the brutal reality of the world she had been born into. She waited, her heart pounding against her ribs, her body tense with anticipation. She knew that Lorenzo was risking everything to save her, that he was facing impossible odds. The door burst open, and Lorenzo stood there, his face grim, his eyes dark with fury. He was holding a gun, his knuckles white as he gripped the weapon. He was covered in blood, some of it his own, some of it belonging to her father's men. "Francesca," he said, his voice rough.
"We have to go. Now."
She didn't hesitate. She grabbed his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. He pulled her out of the room, into the chaos of the hallway. The palazzo was a war zone. Bodies lay scattered on the floor, the air thick with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Her father's men were fighting fiercely, defending their territory, their dawn. Lorenzo led her through the maze of corridors, his body shielding her from the danger. He moved with a deadly grace, a predator in his element. He shot down anyone who stood in their way, his aim precise, his movements ruthless. She saw the fear in the eyes of her father's men, the desperation as they realized that they were losing. They were fighting a losing battle against a force that was stronger, more determined. They reached the main entrance, the grand staircase leading down to the foyer. Her father was there, standing at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of cold fury. He was holding a gun, his hand steady. "Lorenzo," he spat, the name a curse on his lips. "You dare to trespass on my territory? To steal what is mine?" Lorenzo stopped, his gaze locking with her father's. "She was never yours to keep," he said, his voice low and menacing. Antonio laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. She is a Barone. She belongs to me, to this family. She belongs to herself, Lorenzo countered.
And she chooses to be with me.
Her father raised his gun, aiming it at Lorenzo. Francesca gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. Father, no,
she cried.
But it was too late. He fired. Lorenzo reacted instantly, pushing Francesca out of the way, taking the bullet himself. He grunted in pain, stumbling backward. Francesca screamed, rushing to his side. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over the wound, her mind reeling. Lorenzo, she cried, her voice choked with sobs. He looked at her, his eyes filled with pain, but also with love. Go, he whispered, his voice weak. Get out of here. No, she refused. I won't leave you. He reached up and touched her cheek, his fingers leaving a streak of blood on her skin. You have to, he said. It's the only way. He pushed her away, his strength fading. He looked up at her father, his eyes filled with defiance. You may have won this battle, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But you will never win the war. Her father stood over him, his guns still smoking. He looked down at Lorenzo, his expression unreadable. Then, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the depths of the palazzo. Francesca was left alone with Lorenzo, his body growing cold in her arms. She cradled him, her tears falling onto his face, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She had lost everything. Her family, her home, her love. She was alone, adrift in a world of violence and betrayal. She didn't know how long she sat there, holding him, lost in her grief. The sounds of the battle had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Finally, she forced herself to move. She knew that she had to leave, to escape before her father's men returned. She stood up, her legs shaky, her body numb. She looked down at Lorenzo one last time, her heart aching with a pain that was almost unbearable. I love you, she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. I will always love you. A sob escaped, wrenching and ragged, tearing at her soul. She turned and fled, leaving behind the broken vows and shattered dreams of a life that could have been. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to run away from the carnage. Chapter 12. A glimmer of hope in the ruins. Francesca ran blindly through the night, her lungs burning, her legs aching. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from the palazzo, from the scene of the carnage, from the ghosts of her past. She stumbled through the dark streets, her mind reeling, her heart shattered. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her love. She was alone, adrift in a world that had suddenly become cold and hostile. She eventually found herself on the outskirts of the city, near the docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt and fish, the sound of the waves crashing against the seawall a constant reminder of the vast, unforgiving ocean that lay beyond. She collapsed onto a deserted bench, her body trembling with exhaustion and grief. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill, but the cold had seeped into her bones, into her soul. She closed her eyes, her mind replaying the events of the night, the images of violence and death, the memory of Lorenzo's lifeless body in her arms. She felt a profound sense of despair, of hopelessness, a certainty that her life was over. A sudden sound startled her. She opened her eyes, her heart pounding. She saw a figure approaching her, emerging from the shadows. It was a woman, old and weathered, her face etched with the lines of a hard life. She was dressed in simple clothing, her head covered with a shawl. The woman stopped in front of Francesca, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and kindness. "Child," she said, her voice raspy, "what troubles you so?" Francesca hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But there was something in the woman's eyes, a warmth, a compassion, that made her feel safe. She poured out her story, her voice choked with sobs. She told the woman everything about her family, about Lorenzo, about the violence and betrayal that had shattered her life. The woman listened patiently, her expression unchanging. When Francesca was finished, She reached out and took her hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. "You have suffered much, child," she said. "But you are not alone." She told Francesca that she was part of a hidden network, a group of women who had also been victims of the mafia, women who had lost their loved ones, their homes, their lives. They helped each other, supported each other, offered a safe haven for those who had nowhere else to turn. "We call ourselves L'Ombre," she said. "The shadows. We live in the darkness, but we offer a glimmer of hope." Francesca was hesitant at first. She had been taught to trust no one, to rely only on her family. But she had no family left, no one to turn to. And this woman, this stranger, was offering her a lifeline, a chance to start over. She agreed to go with the woman, to join L'Ombre. She was taken to a hidden location, a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of the city. It was a simple dwelling, but it was clean and safe, a refuge from the storm. She was introduced to the other women, a diverse group of ages and backgrounds, all united by their shared experiences of loss and betrayal. They welcomed her with open arms, offering her food, clothing, and a place to rest. Francesca spent the next few days in a daze, her mind numb, her body aching. She slept fitfully, haunted by nightmares of violence and death. But slowly, gradually, she began to heal. The women of L'Ombre cared for her, nurtured her, helped her to find a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. She learned that L'Ombre was more than just a support group. They were actively working to undermine the mafia, to expose their crimes, to bring them to justice. They gathered information, provided assistance to witnesses, and worked with sympathetic members of law enforcement. Francesca found herself drawn into their work, her own desire for revenge, for justice, fueling her determination. She had lost everything, but she still had her strength, her intelligence, her will to fight. One evening, as she was sitting with the other women, sharing stories, sharing their pain, she felt a flicker of hope, a spark of light in the darkness. She realized that she was not alone, that she had found a new family, a new purpose. She had a reason to live, a purpose. She realized she had to dismantle the mafia, piece by piece. Chapter 13. The Cost of a Stolen Kiss. Months passed, and Francesca found a new rhythm to her life within L'Ombre. The initial raw grief over Lorenzo's death began to dull, replaced by a steely determination to honor his memory by dismantling the corrupt system that had taken his life. She threw herself into their work, using her intimate knowledge of the Barone family's operations to provide crucial intelligence. She learned the intricate details of their smuggling routes, their money laundering schemes, their network of corrupt officials. She became a valuable asset to L'Ombre, her insights helping them to disrupt the mafia's operations, to expose their crimes to the authorities. But the work was dangerous. She lived in constant fear of discovery, of being recognized by someone from her former life. She knew that her father would not hesitate to kill her if he found her, that her betrayal would never be forgiven. One day, while reviewing a series of intercepted communications, she stumbled upon a name that made her blood run cold: Alessandro De Luca, Lorenzo's father. The communications revealed that Alessandro was planning a major operation, a shipment of illegal weapons that would solidify his family's power and reignite the war with the Baroness. But there was something else, something that didn't make sense. Alessandro was communicating with someone within the Barone family, someone who was providing him with inside information, someone who was helping him to plan the attack. Francesca felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Could it be true? Could there be another traitor within her family, someone working with Alessandro De Luca? She shared her findings with the leader of L'Ombre, a woman named Sophia, the same woman who had found her near the docks. Sophia was a shrewd, experienced operative, her face etched with the scars of past battles. "This is troubling," Sophia said, her voice grave. "If Alessandro De Luca has an informant within the Barone family, it could be devastating." They decided to investigate further, to identify the traitor and expose their plans. Francesca knew that it was a dangerous undertaking, that she was putting herself at risk. But she couldn't stand by and watch as another war erupted, as more lives were lost. She delved deeper into the intercepted communications, tracing the connections, piecing together the puzzle. She discovered that the informant was using a coded language, a series of obscure references that only someone intimately familiar with the Barone family's history would understand. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that the informant was someone she knew, someone she had once trusted. It was her cousin, Isabella. Isabella had always been envious of Francesca, resentful of her position within the family. She had always been ambitious, eager for power, willing to do anything to get ahead. Francesca felt a wave of betrayal wash over her. She had been betrayed by Marco, by her own father, and now by her cousin. It seemed that everyone she had ever trusted had turned against her. She confronted Isabella, meeting her in a secluded location, far from the prying eyes of the Barone family. Isabella denied the accusations at first, but Francesca presented her with the evidence, the irrefutable proof of her treachery. Isabella broke down, confessing everything. She admitted that she had been working with Alessandro De Luca for months, feeding him information, helping him to plan the attack. She had done it for money, for power, for a chance to escape the shadow of her family. "I hate them," Isabella spat, her voice filled with venom. "I hate them all. They deserve to burn." Francesca looked at her cousin, her heart filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. She had once loved Isabella, had considered her a friend. But now, she saw her for what she was, a traitor, a woman consumed by ambition and hatred. The stolen kiss had been costly. "You're finished," Francesca said, her voice cold. She reported Isabella to Lou Amber, and they, in turn, to a contact in the police. It was over. Francesca felt a weight lift from her shoulders, but the emptiness remained. The damage had been done. Chapter 14. Unveiling the Serpent's Deception. The arrest of Isabella sent ripples of shock and disbelief through both the Barone and De Luca families. For Francesca, it was a bittersweet victory. While she felt a sense of justice being served, it also brought back the pain of betrayal and the knowledge that her own family was riddled with deceit. Lou Amber, with Francesca's help, used Isabella's information to disrupt Alessandro De Luca's planned weapons shipment. The operation was a success, a major blow to the De Luca family's power. But Francesca knew that it was only a temporary setback. Alessandro was a cunning and ruthless man, and he would not be deterred easily. Sofia, the leader of Lou Amber, called a meeting. "We've made progress," she said, her voice firm. "But the war is far from over. We need to find a way to end this cycle of violence, to bring lasting peace." Francesca knew that Sofia was right. The constant battles, the betrayals, the bloodshed had taken a toll on everyone. She longed for a life free from fear, from violence, from the weight of her family's legacy. She spent the next few weeks working tirelessly with Lou Amber, gathering intelligence, planning their next move. She was driven by a desire for justice, for revenge, but also by a hope for a better future, a future where she could finally be free. One evening, while reviewing some old documents, she stumbled upon a hidden file, a secret compartment in her father's old desk at the abandoned palazzo. She had returned there, driven by a nagging feeling, a sense that there were still secrets to be uncovered. Inside the file, she found a series of letters, correspondence between her father and Alessandro De Luca. Her blood ran cold. The letters revealed a shocking truth, a deception that had spanned decades. Her father and Alessandro had not been enemies, as everyone believed. They had been partners, collaborators, orchestrating the feud between their families for their own personal gain. The war, the violence, the bloodshed, had all been a carefully constructed charade, a way to control their territories, to eliminate their rivals, to amass even greater power. Francesca felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had been living a lie. Her entire life had been based on a deception. The hatred, the fear, the loyalty had all been meaningless. She realized that her father had been the serpent all along, the mastermind behind the chaos, the one who had manipulated everyone, including his own daughter. She showed the letters to Sofia, her hands trembling. Sofia read them, her eyes widening in disbelief. This changes everything," Sophia said, her voice barely a whisper. They knew that they had to expose the truth, to reveal the deception to both families, to bring an end to the charade. But it was a dangerous undertaking. Her father and Alessandro were powerful men, with vast resources and a network of loyal followers. They decided to leak the information strategically, to sow discord within both families, to turn their own people against them. They used their contacts within the media, within law enforcement, to spread the word, to expose the truth. The revelation sent shockwaves through the mafia underworld. The carefully constructed alliances, the long-standing feuds, crumbled under the weight of the deception. Both the Barone and De Luca families were thrown into chaos, their members turning against each other, questioning everything they had ever believed. The serpent was devouring itself. Francesca watched from the shadows, her heart filled with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had exposed the truth, but the cost had been immense. The unveiling of the serpent's deception was going to destroy everything. She felt very weary. Chapter 15. Crossroads of Fate and Choice. The fallout from the revelation of Antonio and Alessandro's long-standing conspiracy was swift and brutal. The carefully constructed world of the mafia, built on lies and fueled by violence, began to crumble. Both families, once seemingly untouchable, were now fractured and vulnerable. Francesca, watching from the relative safety of Loamber's network, felt a complex mix of emotions. There was a sense of grim satisfaction in seeing her father's empire disintegrate, a measure of revenge for the life he had stolen from her, for Lorenzo's death. But there was also a deep sadness, a sense of loss for the family she had once believed in, for the illusion of belonging that had been shattered. Sophia, ever the pragmatist, saw the chaos as an opportunity. "This is our chance," she said to Francesca. "With both families weakened, we can strike a decisive blow. We can dismantle their operations, expose their crimes, and bring them to justice." Francesca knew Sophia was right, but a part of her hesitated. The thought of escalating the conflict, of potentially causing more bloodshed, weighed heavily on her. She had seen enough violence, enough death. She longed for peace, for a life free from the constant fear and danger. She found herself drawn back to Villa Speranza, the place where she and Lorenzo had shared their forbidden love, the place where she had last felt a glimmer of hope. She stood on the cliff overlooking the sea, the wind whipping through her hair, the waves crashing against the rocks below. She closed her eyes, remembering Lorenzo's touch, his voice, his presence. She felt a profound sense of loss, of a future that had been stolen from her. But she also felt a sense of strength. She had survived, she had endured, and she had found a new purpose. She realized that she couldn't turn back, that she had to see this through to the end. She had a responsibility to Lorenzo, to the other victims of the mafia, to herself. She had to fight for justice, for a future where such violence and betrayal would no longer be possible. She returned to Loamber, her resolve strengthened. She worked with Sophia, planning their final assault on the remnants of both families. They gathered evidence, coordinated with their contacts within law enforcement, and prepared for a final confrontation. But as they were making their final preparations, Francesca received an unexpected message. It was a coded communication, a phrase that only one person would know. Lorenzo. Her heart leaped into her throat. Could it be true? Could he be alive? The message instructed her to meet him at a secluded location, a small church on the outskirts of the city. She hesitated, her mind racing. It could be a trap, a ploy by her father or Alessandro. But she couldn't ignore the possibility, the hope that Lorenzo might still be alive. She told Sophia about the message, her voice trembling. Sophia was skeptical, cautious. "It's too risky, Francesca," she warned. "It could be a trap." "I know," Francesca said. "But I have to go. I have to know." She went to the church alone, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The church was old and deserted, the air thick with the scent of incense and dust. She waited in the shadows, her senses on high alert. A figure emerged from the darkness. Tall, imposing, his face hidden in shadow. "Francesca," a voice said, a voice she knew, a voice she had thought she would never hear again. "Lorenzo." He stepped into the light, and Francesca gasped. He was alive, but he was changed. His face was scarred, his eyes filled with a haunted look. He was thinner, more gaunt, but it was undeniably him. She rushed towards him, her arms wrapping around him, her tears flowing freely. She held him tight, afraid to let go, afraid that he would disappear again. It was a mixture of joy and anguish. "You're alive," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
"How?"
He explained that he had survived the shooting, barely. He had been rescued by a sympathetic doctor, someone who had secretly worked with Loamber. He had been in hiding for months, recovering from his injuries, waiting for the right moment to return. The news was almost overwhelming, and the question lingered. What now? Chapter 16. Blood on the cobblestone streets. Lorenzo's return changed everything. While Francesca felt an overwhelming sense of relief and joy, his presence also brought a new layer of complexity to their situation. He was a marked man, hunted by both the remnants of his own family and the Baroness. He explained his plan to Francesca. He had been working in the shadows, gathering his own loyalists, men who were disillusioned with Alessandro's leadership and the endless cycle of violence. He intended to confront his father, to end the feud once and for all, even if it meant spilling blood on the cobblestone streets of their city. Francesca was torn. She understood his desire for revenge, for justice. But she also feared for his safety, for the potential consequences of another bloody conflict. "There has to be another way," she pleaded. "We can expose them, use the evidence we have. We can go to the authorities." Lorenzo shook his head. "The authorities are corrupt, Francesca. They're in my father's pocket. The only way to end this is to take him down ourselves." She knew he was right. The system was broken, the law twisted to serve the interests of the powerful. They had tried the legal route, and it had failed. She agreed to help him, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. She knew that this was a dangerous path, that they were risking everything. But she couldn't stand by and watch as Lorenzo faced his father alone. They spent the next few days planning their attack, coordinating with Lorenzo's loyalists, gathering weapons and supplies. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. The confrontation took place in the heart of the city, in a historic piazza surrounded by ancient buildings. It was a symbolic location, a place where generations of De Lucas and Baroness had clashed, a place where blood had been spilled before. Lorenzo and his men arrived first, taking up positions around the piazza. They were outnumbered, but they were determined, fueled by a desire for revenge and a hope for a better future. Alessandro De Luca arrived shortly after, accompanied by his own heavily armed men. He was a formidable figure, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes filled with a ruthless determination. The two men faced each other, the silence broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the nervous whispers of onlookers. "Lorenzo," Alessandro said, his voice dripping with venom. "You dare to challenge me? To betray your own family? You betrayed us all." "Father," Lorenzo countered, his voice firm. "You and Antonio Barone, you orchestrated this whole thing. You used us, you sacrificed us, for your own greed." Alessandro laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You were weak, Lorenzo. You were never fit to lead." "I may have been weak," Lorenzo said, "but I am not weak anymore." He raised his hand, signaling his men. The battle erupted. Gunfire shattered the stillness of the piazza, bullets ricocheting off the ancient stones. Men screamed, bodies fell. Blood stained the cobblestones. It was a brutal, chaotic scene, a replay of countless conflicts that had plagued the city for generations. Francesca watched from a hidden vantage point, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw Lorenzo fighting fiercely, his movements precise, his aim deadly. He was a warrior, a leader, a man transformed by his experiences. She saw Alessandro, his face contorted with rage, his guns spitting fire. He was a formidable opponent, ruthless and experienced. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity, the outcome uncertain. Both sides suffered heavy losses, the piazza littered with the bodies of the dead and wounded. Francesca saw Lorenzo stumble, hit by a bullet. She gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. She wanted to rush to his side, to help him, but she knew that she couldn't. She had to stay hidden, to protect herself. Lorenzo regained his footing, his face pale, his body weakened, but his eyes still filled with determination. He continued to fight, his movements slower, but still deadly. The battle was nearing its end, though a victor remained unclear. It was chaos. Chapter 17. A haven in the heart of chaos. The piazza was a scene of carnage, a tableau of violence and death. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, the sounds of gunfire and screams echoing off the ancient buildings. Francesca watched in horror as Lorenzo fought, his body weakened by the bullet wound, his movements becoming increasingly sluggish. She knew that he was running out of time, that he couldn't sustain this fight much longer. She saw Alessandro De Luca, his face contorted with rage, his gun still spitting fire. He was closing in on Lorenzo, his eyes filled with a murderous intent. Francesca knew that she had to do something, that she couldn't just stand by and watch as Lorenzo was killed. She had to intervene, even if it meant risking her own life. She slipped out of her hiding place, her heart pounding against her ribs. She moved quickly, dodging the bullets, weaving through the chaos. She had to reach Lorenzo, to help him. She saw an opportunity, a gap in Alessandro's defenses. She picked up a discarded weapon, a heavy pistol, her hands trembling. She had never fired a gun before, but she knew that she had to try. She aimed the pistol at Alessandro, her finger on the trigger. Her mind was racing, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the piazza. Alessandro staggered, his eyes widening in surprise. He looked down at his chest, at the spreading stain of blood. He collapsed to the ground, his body lifeless. The fighting stopped. The silence descended, heavy and profound. All eyes were on Francesca, on the woman who had just killed the Don of the De Luca family. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and gratitude. He knew that she had saved his life, that she had risked everything for him. He stumbled towards her, his body weakened, his face pale. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Francesca," he whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. He was grateful, relieved, but also overwhelmed by what had just happened. The remaining combatants, from both sides, lowered their weapons. They were exhausted, demoralized, their will to fight broken. The war was over, at least for now. Lorenzo's loyalists surrounded him, protecting him, tending to his wounds. They looked at Francesca with a newfound respect, a recognition of her courage, her loyalty. Francesca and Lorenzo, supported by his men, left the piazza, leaving behind the scene of the carnage, the bodies of the dead, the remnants of a shattered world. They found refuge in a small, secluded apartment, a safe house provided by Loamber. It was a simple dwelling, but it was clean and safe, a haven in the heart of the chaos. Sophia and the other women of Loamber tended to Lorenzo's wounds, providing him with medical care, with comfort, with support. They welcomed Francesca back with open arms, their respect for her deepened by her actions. Lorenzo was weak, but he was alive. He lay in bed, his body bandaged, his face pale. Francesca sat beside him, holding his hand, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and love. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We saved each other," she replied, her voice trembling. They looked at each other, their eyes locking. They had been through so much, had faced so much danger, had lost so much. But they had also found something precious, something real, a love that had defied all odds, a bond that had been forged in the crucible of violence and betrayal. It was a quiet moment, tinged with a desperate relief and hope. But there was still Antonio. Chapter 18. The Ties That Bind and Break. With Alessandro De Luca dead, a major piece of the puzzle had fallen into place, but the threat of Antonio Barone still loomed large. He was cornered, his empire crumbling, but he was also at his most dangerous, a wounded animal backed into a corner. Francesca knew that they couldn't rest, that they had to deal with Antonio before he could regroup and strike back. Lorenzo, still recovering from his injuries, was adamant about being involved, his sense of responsibility and his desire for vengeance burning brightly. "He's my father-in-law," Lorenzo said, his voice weak but firm. "I know how he thinks. I know his weaknesses." Francesca, Sofia, and Lorenzo devised a plan. They would use the evidence they had gathered, the confessions of Isabella and the intercepted communications, to expose Antonio's crimes to the authorities, but this time they would go higher, to officials they knew were not corrupted, individuals they had vetted and trusted through Lou Amber's network. They also knew that Antonio wouldn't go down without a fight. He still had loyalists, men who were willing to die for him, men who were deeply embedded in the city's infrastructure. The operation was risky, a delicate dance between law enforcement and the underworld. They had to move quickly, decisively before Antonio could react. They leaked the information to their trusted contacts within the police and the judiciary. The response was swift and decisive. Warrants were issued, arrests were made, assets were seized. Antonio's empire, built on lies and violence, began to collapse around him. His allies deserted him, his protectors turned against him, his power evaporated. But Antonio himself remained elusive. He had vanished, disappearing into the labyrinthine network of the city, his whereabouts unknown. Francesca knew that he wouldn't surrender, that he would fight to the bitter end. She also knew that he would be coming for her, seeking revenge for her betrayal. She and Lorenzo, along with a small group of Lou Amber members and Lorenzo's loyalists, went into hiding, moving from one safe house to another, constantly on the alert. One evening, as they were preparing to move again, they received a message. It was a single word, written in Antonio's distinctive handwriting: surrender. Francesca knew that it was a trap, a ploy to lure them out into the open. But she also knew that they couldn't run forever, that they had to confront Antonio, to end this once and for all. They decided to meet Antonio, but on their own terms. They chose a location, a neutral ground, a place where they could have some control over the situation. They chose the old abandoned opera house, a once grand building that had fallen into disrepair, a symbol of the city's faded glory. It was a place filled with shadows and secrets, a fitting stage for the final act of their drama. Francesca and Lorenzo arrived first, accompanied by their small group of allies. They took up positions within the opera house, hidden in the shadows, waiting for Antonio. Antonio arrived shortly after alone. He was unarmed, his face a mask of cold resignation. He looked old, defeated, his spirit broken. "Francesca," he said, his voice echoing through the empty opera house. "You have destroyed everything." "You destroyed everything, father," she replied, her voice firm. "You and Alessandro. You built your empires on lies and violence. You sacrificed everything, everyone, for your own greed." Antonio looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and sadness. "I did what I had to do," he said, "to protect our family, our legacy." "There is no family left, father," Francesca said. "There is no legacy. Only ruins." Antonio turned to Lorenzo, his gaze filled with a venomous hatred.
"And you," he spat.
"You took her from me. You corrupted her." "She chose me, father-in-law," Lorenzo said, his voice calm. "She chose love over hate, truth over lies." Antonio laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Love, truth? These are illusions, fantasies. The only reality is power. And you have none." He reached inside his jacket, his hand moving quickly. Francesca and Lorenzo reacted instantly, raising their weapons. But it was too late. Antonio pulled out a small, silver device, a detonator. He smiled, a chilling, triumphant smile. "If I can't have it," he said, "no one can." He pressed the button. A deafening explosion ripped through the opera house, the building shaking violently. The ties that had bound and ultimately broke were severed in fire. Chapter 19. Reckoning Under a Crimson Sky. The explosion rocked the opera house, sending debris flying, the air thick with dust and the acrid smell of explosives. Francesca and Lorenzo, shielded by their allies and their position within the building, were thrown to the ground, but miraculously, they were alive. They scrambled to their feet, coughing, disoriented, their ears ringing. The opera house was collapsing around them, the roof caving in, the walls crumbling. They had to get out and fast. Lorenzo grabbed Francesca's hand, pulling her through the wreckage, their allies following close behind. They navigated the collapsing structure, dodging falling debris, their hearts pounding against their ribs. They reached the entrance, bursting out into the open air, just as another section of the roof collapsed behind them. They were safe for now, but the opera house was gone, reduced to a smoldering ruin. They looked back at the devastation, their faces grim, their bodies covered in dust and grime. Antonio Barone was dead, his final act of defiance a testament to his ruthlessness and his despair. The sky above was turning crimson, the setting sun casting a bloody glow over the city. It was a fitting backdrop to the reckoning that had just taken place, a symbol of the end of an era. Francesca felt a profound sense of emptiness. The war was over, the enemy was defeated, but the cost had been immense. She had lost her family, her home, her innocence. She had seen too much violence, too much death. Lorenzo put his arm around her, pulling her close. He understood her pain, her grief. He had lost much as well. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "We're free." But Francesca knew that it wasn't that simple. The scars of the past would remain. The memories of the violence and betrayal would haunt them. They had survived, but they were changed, forever marked by their experiences. The authorities arrived, police and firefighters swarming the scene. They secured the area, searching for survivors, investigating the explosion. Francesca and Lorenzo, along with their allies, were taken into custody, questioned, their statements taken. They told the truth, revealing everything they knew about Antonio's crimes, about the conspiracy with Alessandro De Luca, about the long, bloody feud that had plagued the city for generations. The authorities, armed with the evidence provided by Francesca, Lorenzo, and Lou Amber, launched a massive investigation, targeting the remnants of both families, dismantling their operations, bringing them to justice. The city, weary of the violence, of the corruption, of the endless cycle of revenge, began to breathe again. There was a sense of hope, a belief that a new era was dawning, an era of peace and justice. Francesca and Lorenzo were released, cleared of any wrongdoing. They had acted in self-defense. They had helped to expose a vast criminal conspiracy. They were hailed as heroes. But Francesca didn't feel like a hero. She felt lost. She had no family, no home, no place to go. Lorenzo looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "What will you do now?" he asked. She didn't know. She had spent her entire life defined by her family, by her role within the mafia. Now that was gone. She was adrift, uncertain of her future. She was a blank canvas. Lorenzo took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "We'll build a new life, a life free from the shadows of the past." The last of the smoke had dissipated, and the sky was almost dark. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Lorenzo's words, "We'll figure it out together," echoed in Francesca's mind, a promise of a future that seemed both terrifying and exhilarating. She had spent her life bound by duty, by tradition, by the expectations of her family. Now, she was free, but the freedom felt overwhelming. They left the city, seeking refuge in a small, secluded village on the coast, far from the violence and the memories of the past. They rented a modest cottage overlooking the sea, a place where they could heal, where they could rebuild their lives. They spent their days walking on the beach, exploring the countryside, talking, sharing their stories, their hopes, their fears. They were two broken souls, finding solace in each other's company. their love a fragile flower blooming in the ruins of their former lives. But the past was not so easily escaped. They were haunted by nightmares, by the memories of the violence they had witnessed, the loss they had endured. They struggled with guilt, with regret, with the weight of their choices. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset over the sea, Francesca spoke. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not a Barone, not a DeLuca. I'm nothing." Lorenzo took her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "You're Francesca," he said. "You're the woman I love. That's all that matters." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "But what about our families? What about the legacy of violence and hatred?" "We can't change the past," Lorenzo said. "But we can choose our future. We can break the cycle, create a new legacy, a legacy of love and peace." He told her about his plans, his vision for a future free from the mafia, a future where their children, if they were to have any, would not have to live in fear, would not have to carry the burden of their family's sins. He wanted to use his knowledge, his connections to help others, to fight against corruption, to build a better world. He wanted to dedicate his life to making amends for the sins of his family, for the violence he had participated in. Francesca listened, her heart filled with a growing sense of hope. She realized that Lorenzo was right, that they couldn't change the past, but they could shape the future. They could choose a different path, a path of healing, of forgiveness, of love. She decided to join him, to work alongside him, to build a new life, a new legacy. She would use her own experiences, her own knowledge, to help others, to fight against the darkness that had consumed her family for so long. They returned to the city, not to the world of the mafia, but to the world of ordinary people, of everyday struggles, of simple joys. They started a foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to helping victims of violence, to supporting communities ravaged by crime, to promoting peace and reconciliation. They worked tirelessly, pouring their hearts and souls into their work, finding purpose and meaning in their shared mission. They became a beacon of hope, a symbol of redemption, a testament to the power of love to overcome hatred. They faced opposition, threats, challenges. But they persevered, their love for each other, their commitment to their cause, giving them strength. One day, as they were walking through the city, they passed the old opera house, now a fenced-off ruin, a reminder of the past, of the final confrontation, of the price they had paid for their freedom. Francesca stopped, her gaze fixed on the ruins. She felt a pang of sadness, of loss, but also a sense of closure. Lorenzo put his arm around her, pulling her close. "It's over, Francesca," he said. "We're free." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. She looked up at the sky, at the clouds drifting peacefully, at the sun shining brightly. "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a newfound peace. "We are free." The final confrontation was over. The hearts and loyalties had aligned. Epilogue. Years passed, and Francesca and Lorenzo built a life far removed from the shadowed world of their ancestors. Their foundation thrived, becoming a significant force for good in the city and extending its reach even beyond. They didn't erase the past, but they transformed its legacy, turning a history of violence into a future of healing. They had children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up knowing nothing of the famiglia's bloody history. They were raised with stories of courage and resilience, of their parents' work to make the world a better place, but the specifics of their origins remained a carefully guarded secret, a burden they would never have to bear. Francesca, her silver hair now a crown of wisdom and experience, often found herself reflecting on the journey she had taken. From the sheltered, suffocating existence within the Barone Palazzo to the vibrant, purposeful life she had built with Lorenzo, it was a transformation she could scarcely have imagined. The pain of the past was still there, a dull ache that sometimes resurfaced in dreams, but it no longer defined her. She had found peace, not in forgetting, but in forgiving, in choosing love over hate, in building a future that honored the memory of those she had lost. Lorenzo, his scarred face a testament to the battles he had fought, both internal and external, had found a serenity he had never known before. The ruthlessness that had once defined him had mellowed, replaced by a deep compassion, a fierce determination to protect the innocent, to prevent others from suffering the fate he and Francesca had endured. One warm evening, as they sat on the terrace of their home, overlooking the city they had helped to heal, Lorenzo took Francesca's hand. The city lights twinkled below, a vibrant tapestry of life and activity, a stark contrast to the darkness they had once known. "Do you ever regret it?" Francesca asked, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the cityscape. "Leaving that world behind?" Lorenzo smiled, a gentle, loving smile that reached his eyes. "Never," he said. "The only regret I have is that it took me so long to find you, to find this." He gestured to their surroundings, to their home, to the life they had built together. It wasn't a life of luxury or power, but it was a life of meaning, of purpose, of love. Francesca squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a profound sense of gratitude. She had found her freedom, not in escaping her past, but in confronting it, in transforming it, in building a future that was worthy of the sacrifices they had made. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Francesca and Lorenzo sat in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with a quiet joy. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. They knew there would be challenges. It could not always be peaceful. There were always echoes. But they faced the future together. The end.